What is replayability? When it comes to video games, this term is thrown around a lot. As something games seemingly bank on to entice you, as something players want, or as something seemingly lacking from a game. I see it most often used on the player's side to describe how much they got their money's worth from a video game. Now, I don't believe in there being some sort of formula that makes a good price for a game based on its playtime. There is, however, an argument to be made that depending on how expensive a game was, if it offered very little of substance to engage with, you might feel rightly ripped off. This is where replayability oftentimes comes in to save the day. Let's take a game like Undertale, for example. It's not terribly long, but also not terribly expensive. If you did, however, feel a bit let down upon reaching the end, the game will usually actually recommend you play it again and make some different choices. Not only will this allow you to see different outcomes of events you didn't see before, but it also starts reacting to the fact that you have played the game before. This plays into something I would like to get into later, so keep it in mind. At the end, there aren't just multiple major endings to attain, but in the case of the neutral ending, there are also many variations to it, depending on your specific actions throughout your playthrough. This means that repeated playthroughs in which you try different things aren't just encouraged, but also very rewarding and will show you more aspects to the game's world and story. Undertale is very specifically designed around this concept. But a lot of different RPGs do things like this in some way. The Megami Tensei series, for example, has different endings and dialogue changes depending on your alignment, and computer RPGs like Gothic and Fallout can oftentimes take major branching paths depending on who you decide to side with. In these longer games, it's no longer really a matter of price and more a matter of something that is cool to have or even expected. Depending on who you ask, the RPG genre might be entirely based on this concept of a game reacting to your choices and giving you consequences. For a lot of people, when they talk about replayability in games, this is at its crux. If I were to break the game down to just this aspect of the RPG, then you essentially arrive at a visual novel. The degree to which you can influence a VN's story varies wildly. In romance VNs, which partner to strive for can either be a slow process over a long-winded management game or common route, or be handled simply in a sort of ladder structure where one choice will on its own send you down an entirely different path. In either case, there's oftentimes hours of unique content in these different routes leading to entirely different endings. This makes VNs not just some of the most replayable games ever, but also some of the games you are most expected to replay to see all of the different outcomes. Some games even tie a larger meta-narrative into playing all routes, which again I will talk about later. Each of these games do, however, in general have one thing in common, and that's that there is essentially a finite number of replays before you would just be seeing repeats. This, of course, makes me think of the genre that is entirely based on avoiding this problem, the roguelike. I am not going to be arguing about this term here, and I will be using it to mean games that are largely procedurally generated on each run-through. These runs are generally short and meant to be done in one session, but the random nature of the game's content is supposed to keep it fresh. It is unlikely either way that you would beat a roguelike on your first try, so to beat the game you will usually have to play it again and again as you learn the game's rules and how to give yourself the best advantages to actually win. This, for all intents and purposes, infinite replayability that keeps the game fresh even if you have already beaten it, is how so many people end up putting insane hours into these games. Games like The Binding of Isaac, for example, then started to ask the question of how much can this concept be stretched? Now, instead of just needing to learn the game, there are unlocks, ways to influence the game to be more, or in Isaac's case, less in your favor. This is what most likely is the main distinction between what people call a roguelike and a roguelite, which is an even dumber term and I refuse to use it in any serious way. But this is also where the question comes up of what exactly constitutes a replay in a game such as Isaac. Is each run a separate playthrough of The Binding of Isaac? To this point, that's the assumption I have been arguing under, but I don't actually think that's the case. To me, starting a new save file and wiping your progress is when you start replaying The Binding of Isaac. The permanent unlocks are the problem for me, I guess. Not a problem with the game, but with the assertion that Isaac is replayable. To me, The Binding of Isaac is a game that you keep playing, not one that you replay. In the same vein, I don't really consider visual novels to be replayed if you are doing different routes, or your playthroughs of Undertale to ever count as actual separate playthroughs unless you specifically make sure that they are. To me, due to how its mechanics and story work, Undertale isn't really finished unless you have decided to stop playing. You can finish The Binding of Isaac Repentance by achieving whatever the highest tier completion rating is called these days and unlocking everything and mastering every challenge in the game, but you can also still keep playing the same playthrough afterwards. Unlocking everything again is a long and arduous process, which really makes you miss some of the stuff you got used to on your other save file, plus there's usually really only one way to unlock something. You're essentially going down a checklist, so I would actually consider The Binding of Isaac to be not very replayable at all. Yes, some people do it, including myself, but at that point you have to acknowledge that you are doing this despite of the game's replayability, not because of it. In that sense, it's more similar to many competitive multiplayer games or live service games. Do you consider those to be very replayable? I don't think that's really a concept that works super well in those kinds of games because they are already meant to essentially be played forever. Similarly to Isaac, an entirely new playthrough would require you to either wipe your account or make a new one. In some cases, this is turned into a game mechanic with seasons that either reset your progress or allow you to play in a separate world from your main world with all of your progress. But I'm getting a little bit off track. There are more types of replayability I want to take a look at. Let's go back to the short game problem. A more popular solution for this from back in the 80s that has kinda gone out of style is a type of score system. Incentivizing getting a better score in a more or less predictable game for either bragging rights or some sort of reward at the end used to be a relatively popular way to make your game more replayable. Especially arcade games would bank on you repeatedly spending money on the hunt for the high score. Over the course of the 80s and 90s, this largely disappeared in its base format, but some forms of this still exist. Games like Mega Man Zero or Devil May Cry give you ranks based on your performance, and achieving higher ranks is again bragging rights in the same way a high score would be. Time attack games like Trackmania and Super Sami-Roll also fall into a similar category, but again challenge the definition of a replay. Yes, these games are essentially infinitely replayable depending on your motivation to get a good time, but again they more so veer into the direction of live service games. You aren't usually starting an entire new playthrough just to get a better time on CO8 obstacle. This is kind of turning into a semantic argument, but I just can't really accept that continuing to play a game is supposed to equal replayability. What do I think then makes a replayable game? Sure, high variance and content between playthroughs can make repeat playthroughs very enticing, and that's certainly what most people seem to agree on is what makes a game replayable, but personally I think most games that focus on that kind of replayability are just too long and still too similar to actually replay. Hearing about other people's experiences and comparing what different decisions change is cool, but I very rarely feel the need to personally replay a game like that, unless it is actually still continuing the same playthrough as I talked about earlier. What I consider especially replayable then is a game that is mechanically fun and preferably pretty short. A game where what you are doing doesn't actually need to change because it's just as fun the second time. A game like, for example, Mega Man X. Yes, experimenting with different Maverick and upgrade orders and how they change different stages in a way makes Mega Man X designed to be a bit more replayable than the average game. But what actually makes it replayable in my opinion is its game feel and structure. Getting better at most games is a rewarding experience, so a short and difficult game like Mega Man X really lends itself to this kind of mastering. By the end of your first playthrough, you'll likely just start to really get a feel for how to dash and use the charge shot effectively, which in my case made me want to see how much more easily I could get through the Maverick stages and boss fights on a repeat playthrough. This is the point where in a lot of games you go back to the start and then slowly start to figure out a game's pain points. You now know what to do, so you can be confident in your gameplay and focus on the execution. No more figuring out how to pass a section, just gameplay. In a game like, for example, Crash Bandicoot 1 then, this is where I start to really feel things like that game's stiff jump or the way you keep moving when spinning, no matter what I'm doing with a stick. Details I might have noticed earlier on now become major issues in my quest to enjoying the mechanics of the game. The more familiar I am with the game, the more my attention will move to these details and they might start to annoy me. Now, if I continue to play this game, I would eventually master these mechanics either way and the annoyance might disappear into the background. However, these things are still a major hindrance to my desire to replay a game. Mega Man X has minimal amounts of this. The movement mechanics are pretty much perfect and the combat is great and only gets better with more knowledge of what is best to use where and adjusting the routing through the game based on that. If there's one gripe I have about pretty much the entire Mega Man X series, including the first game, it's the sub-tank system. Simply put, grinding to refill sub-tanks is not fun. This is again a case where mastery will make this less and less of an issue, but personally I still like to have at least a couple sub-tanks for Sigma and the goddamn Spider. This makes Mega Man X one of the most replayable games for me. Most of my other favorite games I do like to replay from time to time have some part to them I'm really not looking forward to. Spyro 2 and 3 have their mini-games, the same with Crash Bandicoot Warped. Crash 2 then is almost there, but it has the level Night Fight. Ratchet & Clank then is just a bit too long for one session replay. Anyway, this type of replayable is not really something I ever hear mention of at all. I guess it's just a bit hard to quantify compared to games that have mechanics that specifically aid replays, but personally this is the kind that I enjoy. There's this plague infecting video game discourse these days that there has to be some sort of productivity to what you're playing. Play some new games or make progress in a live service game or whatever. If you're just doing the same thing you've already done, that seems like a waste of time to me. Unless you're speedrunning, of course. I think this mindset just takes a lot of the fun out of video games for no reason. It's okay to just replay a game because it's fun, even if you do already know all there is to know about it and have no intention to compete whatsoever.